What does the Chernobyl nuclear disaster more than 20 years ago have to do with concerns over global warming today? Find out next on Living with Chernobyl.
This is the most important report on the future published by this government in its time in office. Some will always make a case for doubt in an issue such as this, partly because its implications are so frightening.
That is what is at stake. Our ability to live on planet Earth.
We didn't ask for it, but here it is.
Global climate change is here. It's not something that's going to occur 10 years from now or 50 years from now, but it's here.
The climate change issue has now come to the forefront of the environmental agenda, and it is very obvious that nuclear energy is just about the only major baseload electricity source that can actually replace fossil fuels as a source of energy.
Will global climate change spark the resurgence of nuclear power in the United States? Today, nuclear reactors supply a sixth of the world's electricity. Almost all of the electricity produced in France is atomic energy, and since the start of this decade, more than 20,000 nuclear megawatts have come online, mainly in Asia. But in the United States, where more than a fifth of the electricity we use comes from nuclear power, no new nuclear plants have been built for decades. The Chernobyl disaster, more than 20 years ago, turned off public support for nuclear power. Today, concerns about catastrophic climate change may turn that support back on, with new nuclear reactors replacing coal-fired power plants and outdated nuclear plants. But what are the risks of building new reactors in today's world? It is time to reconsider the pros and cons of nuclear power.
This is becoming one of the most important environmental questions of our time because of the climate crisis that we're now facing and the importance of emission-free power at a very large scale that we need to look at, again, way more seriously from nuclear power.
The problem of global warming shouldn't cause anybody to take a second look at nuclear power, because the reality is what global warming tells us is we need to find the cheapest way to get rid of carbon emissions possible. We shouldn't build new coal-fired power plants. We shouldn't build new nuclear power plants.
Why would you ban nuclear reactors because of one accident in a reactor that was badly designed, badly constructed, and badly operated? It was actually an accident waiting to happen.
The world's worst nuclear accident at Chernobyl in April 1986 was all the more alarming for taking place in the former Soviet Union, where accidents were state secrets. Ukraine's Chernobyl nuclear power plant borders Russia and Belarus. Just after midnight local time on Saturday, April 26th, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded when a poorly planned experiment went bad. The radioactive fallout was detected in Sweden 2 days later, but the Soviet authorities refused to admit anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Only after Swedish diplomats gave notice they were about to file an official alert with the International Atomic Energy Authority did Moscow finally issue a short statement.
An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors has been damaged. Steps are being taken to deal with the situation. Aid is being given to those affected. The government has formed a commission of inquiry.
The word damaged hardly reflected the truth of a reactor in meltdown. Open to the sky, its graphite sections burning at 5,000 degrees, sending a column of radioactive debris thousands of feet into the atmosphere. Northwest winds carried the radioactive debris for miles. No one was left more in the dark than the Soviet citizens most closely affected. At first, life continued as normal in the regions surrounding Chernobyl. Most people spent the Saturday outside, enjoying the unusually warm spring weather. Meanwhile, as in the rest of the Soviet Union, citizens went ahead with their May Day festivities, 5 days after the accident, completely unaware of the radiation bearing down on them.
There was an original sin with Chernobyl that the government failed to disclose the accident for a number of days, so it left people in a state of uncertainty. Rumors began to spread, and people came to believe that because the government had withheld information, the accident was far more serious than they were ever really told.
The lack of information from the Soviets also encouraged exaggeration and mistakes in the Western media.
This is what we are hearing tonight. A United Press International report, so far unconfirmed, that more than 2,000 may be dead. Soviet government-controlled television officially puts the number of dead at 2.
Even higher figures appeared on many front pages the next day. Most of the people killed in the days immediately after the disaster were emergency workers who toiled to contain the radioactivity released by the reactor meltdown. Alex Melnikov was one of the first responders to arrive at Chernobyl. He was exposed to very high levels of radiation.
What is that, the metal, for?
We call it the liquidator medal. It's the people who was working in Chernobyl zone and in sarcophagus are called themselves liquidators. I came to Chernobyl on the 3rd of May. The accident took place 26th of April, so it was impossible to go inside because the levels of radiation around the unit were very high, about 400 rems.
I remember vividly a conversation with one of the most senior Ukrainians in charge of the so-called liquidators, the people who cleaned up the mess afterwards, and he told me that mysteriously almost all of his workers were officially recorded as having received just less than the maximum allowable dose, more or less identical numbers for all of them, and that they were then scattered all over the then Soviet Union in such a way that it would be impossible to do any epidemiological follow-up to see what happened to their health over the long run.
Were you concerned about your exposure to all this radiation? Did you have a dosimeter?
A dosimeter records cumulative exposure to radiation.
Yes, I had a dosimeter, but I had a special cage for my dosimeter. Well, you mean it was a lead case. Lead case, I put dosimeter inside. But why, by the way, why? The salary in Chernobyl, we were paid 5 times as more as in Kyiv. But we were told that if you got 25 rem, if your dose is 25 rem, you will be sent out to Kyiv.
Once Melnikov almost reached that maximum allowable radiation limit, he shielded his dosimeter so he could earn more money.
For firefighters, for the duty shift, which was in Chernobyl when the accident took place, they had very high exposure. It was very high exposure. Their skin was burned. They were red. I was in the hospital during these years about 5 or 6 times. In the 1986, in August, I was changing the blood.
The sort of exposure that cleanup workers were being subjected to every day on a regular basis, lack of Geiger counters, lack of cleaning operations, washrooms, facilities, protests by the cleanup workers. So really appalling conditions.
So how many people do you know or do you know of who died?
By names, I believe I have to think, but I know 4. 3 from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and 1 from firefighters. It's not, you mean, diseases not so much as somebody thinks. It's my opinion. This type of reactor, which was burst in Chernobyl, it is the cheapest reactor. It is the cheapest reactor. Soviet power plants are made without confinement, without containment, because there was such a point of view. Soviet power plants will not burst at all. It's simply impossible. So not necessary to build the containment.
That class of Soviet reactor was a cheap way to move from weapons-grade production reactors into civilian electrical reactors without designing them safely. There was no containment structure on Chernobyl or any of the other Chernobyl-class reactors, and the operators basically blew it up, almost as if you did it on purpose. It was so stupid.
In the United States, the fallout from Chernobyl was political, not radioactive. Over 10,000 miles west of Chernobyl, in Sacramento, California, anti-nuclear and environmental groups joined forces to organize a public referendum to shut down the Rancho Seco nuclear power plant, operated by the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD. This televised debate in Sacramento, 4 months after the Chernobyl accident, reflected the mood and politics at that time.
Tonight on Express, they said it would never happen, but it did, and the nuclear industry may never recover. One radiation specialist is now predicting more than 500,000 cancer deaths as the result of the Chernobyl disaster.
Good evening, I'm Spencer Michaels. Before April of this year, the issue of nuclear power generation had mostly receded from the headlines, with some 100 plants quietly churning out 16% of this country's electricity. But on April 25th, all hell broke loose in Russia and in the media with the explosion and release of radioactive material at Chernobyl. That accident reignited the bitter debate between pro-nuke and anti-nuke forces and raised old and new questions about the future of nuclear power. What I think is interesting is what's going to happen to nuclear power in this country in the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. Is it going to continue? Is anybody going to build any new plants? No. Emory Lovins from Denver, the Rocky Mountain Institute. What do you think about the future of nuclear power in this country?
There isn't one. No more will be built. The only question is whether the plants already operating will continue to operate for their lifetimes or whether they'll be shut down prematurely. That could happen because of another big accident anywhere, or because the plants have problems and start to cost too much to keep up, or because we notice, as we should have noticed some time ago, that it's cheaper not to run them than to run them.
Rancho Seco wasn't the only nuclear power plant Californians wanted closed. The Diablo Canyon plant was also causing worry.
You're talking about risking the lives of our children, and I don't see how you can sit there like gods and predict that there won't be an accident and our children's lives are at stake.
Though no one believes an accident exactly like Chernobyl would happen at Diablo Canyon, critics claim a major radiation release of disastrous proportions could take place. The San Luis Obispo evacuation plans estimate that people would be affected within a 15-mile radius. At Chernobyl, some people were evacuated as far away as 100 miles. In San Luis Obispo, they plan for contamination up to a 50-mile radius. The European Common Market refused all food grown within 600 miles of Chernobyl.
Since an accident like Chernobyl had never happened before, scientists and doctors could only give their best guess about the consequences.
I have no reason to doubt what the Soviets say about the number of acute radiation deaths, that it's been under 50. But the number of fatal cancers to come over the years and decades ahead as a direct result of this accident will not be lower than 500,000.
Studies now show the actual number to be less than 1% of Dr. Goffman's estimate. But the fear of an American Chernobyl prevailed. Anti-nuclear activists succeeded in shutting down Rancho Seco in 1989. No new nuclear plants have been built in the United States since. A decade earlier, Hollywood fed fears of nuclear power with its 1979 blockbuster China Syndrome. Less than a month after the opening of this film nationwide, the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania had a major accident that seemed to mirror the China Syndrome doomsday scenario. Even though the 3 Mile Island containment structure worked as designed to prevent the leakage of radiation, public attitudes about nuclear power, in reality as in the film, never recovered.
3 Mile Island in 1979 was really the beginning of the end of nuclear energy throughout most of the West, whereas Chernobyl in 1986 just completely solidified or cemented that opposition for another 20 years.
What really did happen at Chernobyl, and what really were the consequences? With the benefit of more than 20 years' perspective, we can finally separate facts from fears, information from speculation. But what we know now differs from what many people still believe.
Do you remember Chernobyl? What happened at Chernobyl?
I think it had a meltdown or something like that.
There was a huge release of, radiation.
And there was contamination spread throughout that town, and the town had to be abandoned.
The larger part of it was that there was an enormous cover-up.
Say for people who have died since then as a result of it, it's probably in the 20 or 30,000s or more.
It's a horrible number. A couple 100,000, I think. 200,000, somewhere in that neighborhood.
The number I hear is like 4,000 or so, but I understand it's not very well known.
What do you think about nuclear power as a solution to the U.S. energy needs?
It isn't, I don't think.
I don't think anyone's figured out what to do with the waste yet.
No. Dirty. No. I hate it. It's throwing all our it's so bad. It's throwing all our garbage into the future.
Patrick Moore was one of the founders of Greenpeace, a global environmental activist organization. But since becoming pro-nuclear as a solution to global warming, he has been ostracized from that community.
People are fearful of nuclear radiation for many reasons, one of the main ones being the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. That was one of the most shocking things that has happened in history, and it scared people to death. I don't think it was so much the radiation that scared people as the idea of a bomb going off that could destroy an entire city in a second.
In the more than 60 years that have passed since nuclear bombs destroyed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there has been extensive research on the medical effects of radiation on the survivors. Mort Mendelsohn is one of the world's leading experts on the medical effects of radiation. He has a medical degree as well as a PhD in physics. He spent many years in Hiroshima and Nagasaki directing research on atomic bomb survivors at the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. He was awarded Japan's highest civilian honor, the Third Order of the Sacred Treasure, for his efforts coordinating research and publishing reports on the ongoing medical follow-up of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors.
The nuclear bombs exploded hundreds of feet in the air above them, never touched the ground, so there was no radioactive fallout. The exposure they had happened in a fraction of a second. with very energetic X-rays and with particles called neutrons. After about 2 months, those who were going to die died, and the rest became survivors. Your bone marrow cells, which are the most sensitive to this kind of exposure, your bone marrow cells are effectively wiped out, and this means your blood will no longer clot well. It means you can't fight infections well. It means you're not making red blood cells anymore. Now, if you manage to get through that period, bone marrow cells recover and repopulate the bone marrow. Your white blood count comes back to normal, and on you go through what's likely to be the rest of your life, with very little to show for that exposure that you had. At the very center, the hypocenters, you have the people who had the largest doses. These are immediately lethal, and you don't expect any survivors. But as you move outward, you finally get to a point where the doses were so low that you don't expect to find a measurable effect. And these people that are way on the outside, about a mile, 2 miles outside the hypocenter, are what are used as the controls. There are only 400 people, according to the analyses that we've been able to do, that died of radiation-induced cancer.
So of the ones who survived the first 2-3 months, only 400 more died from radiation-induced cancer?
It's a remarkably small number, but it's also a remarkably well understood number. We know a lot that we never knew before or that we misunderstood before.
What were the health effects of the accident for the people living in the Chernobyl area? For the 20th anniversary of Chernobyl, the United Nations assembled over 100 international scientists to make a definitive report on the aftermath. UN Program Manager Louisa Vinton presented their findings.
There are huge myths and misconceptions surrounding Chernobyl. Many people in the affected regions feel that they're doomed to a shorter life expectancy, to lots and lots of diseases, and they're especially concerned about their children. The Chernobyl Forum has concluded that the number of those who died from direct radiation exposure and diseases attributable to radiation is very limited, and that's people who had acute radiation sickness, so that would be among the emergency workers, and that's around 50, under 50 people. And then there's another group of people who suffered from Chernobyl who had thyroid cancer.
That turned out to be a significant medical problem. And this was the radioactive iodine effect on the thyroid. Within a few years of the accident, they started to pick up thyroid nodules that were, some were precancerous, some were cancerous, and it was all in young people. Then it became clear that there really was an epidemic of low-grade thyroid cancers, treatable, all curable if you get at them properly.
And of those, 15 children died, and the rest were treated successfully. So that's how Chernobyl Forum counts the number of people who died directly from radiation exposure.
Another concern is the number of people exposed to radioactivity from Chernobyl who are at increased risk of dying from cancer in the years ahead.
Chernobyl Forum also looks into the possibility of elevated rates of cancer and what might be the impact over all of time of low-dose radiation on this broad population. As many as 4,000 people may die between now and over the next several dozen years from elevated rates of cancer.
With a third of the population in industrialized countries dying of cancer under normal conditions, the 4,000 cases that might occur due to Chernobyl radiation exposure would be impossible to identify among the over 100,000 cases of naturally occurring cancer. It would be statistically insignificant.
You can see the way the wind blew the radiation initially.
Professor David Maples has spent much of his career finding the answers to Chernobyl. He believes that the United Nations report that less than 65 people died from the accident is not accurate.
The numbers of deaths from that early period were probably more in the hundreds.
If you can actually track down the people who were exposed and know how much they were exposed, then you could correlate that with their health conditions later. But lacking those two bits of data, I don't see how one could draw any conclusions.
I think the real conclusion one needs to draw is not to quibble over whether it's 60, 4,000, but it's to keep in mind that we're looking at orders of magnitude, and all these orders of magnitude are so much lower than the perception in the public mind about the consequences of Chernobyl.
Radiation exposure drops rapidly as distance from the source increases. For example, the cathode ray tube in this TV set shoots charged particles onto the screen and through it. When the distance from the TV is doubled, that radiation exposure decreases by a factor of 4. At triple the distance, the exposure is 9 times less. The same effect applies to the radioactive material released at Chernobyl. The workers at the reactor and the firefighters who worked directly on the reactor to contain the burning core received intense full-body exposure.
The main concerns were right around the reactor, right around Chernobyl, and some of the more intense fallout areas.
While winds carried Chernobyl fallout radiation around the world, the significant contamination occurred in a 50 to 100 mile area north and east of the reactor. Journalists Cliff Orloff and Olga Shaligan traveled to the Chernobyl contamination zone in 2005 to interview some of the survivors still living there. At a main intersection, a police checkpoint was set up to keep those without proper authorization from entering the area, but numerous small country roads allowed access to the restricted zones. The contaminated zone was primarily an agricultural region before the accident. Now it is mostly abandoned. These legacies of Soviet central planning are frozen in time. 20 years after the accident, weeds have overtaken this headquarters for the region's collective farms. The village of Bartolomeivka had over 900 residents before the Chernobyl accident. With high radiation levels, it is officially uninhabited, but 10 people still live here. There is no longer running water, gas, or electricity here. The collective farm and charcoal factory that once provided jobs for the villagers no longer exist. They were shut down and abandoned after the accident.
And I went to 78. It was 97 here.
Katya Lapitskaya, 76 years old, has been living with these high radiation levels in her garden for a long time, but she claims to be in good health.
Okay. What's your reading?
Very high.
Ага. Приезжают позже, проверяют, там радиоактивность, говорят, не жите.
Приезжают, коли приезжают.
Что каждый год,
и выгоняют, хотели выгнать их. И она сказала, эта хозяйка, что я тут помру своим добрым, никуда я не поеду. Ой, не поехала и доброго.
You know,
what's the reading there?
85. The water is showing levels above the acceptable region.
Even though this woman drinks water with high radiation levels, she has no complaints.
Как-то разлятно не пахнет, ничего нет. Едим все. Вы знаете что? Практически ничего не ощущаем.
Despite the radiation levels, some people never left. More Chernobyl survivors were said to be living in the nearby village of Glebovka.
Я ж говорю, вот это у меня дочка это средняя, все нормальные, и внуки все нормальные, внуки все на лето сюда приезжают, вот кончают школу, и тут все лето, все нормально, не болеют, они ничего. Я не знаю, не болеют, не... Еще пока, Бог миловал, Господь, не болеют.
These survivors rely on the land for most of their food. Mushrooms draw radioactivity from the earth, and the people here are advised not to eat them. But mushrooms are a traditional part of their diet, and selling them earns much needed cash.
Я говорю, она радиация нам уже, мы про нее даже уже не думаем. Она как вроде бы и не было. Мы привыкли, вошли уже в колею, графики, все. Так что. Ну, конечно, нас предупреждали, все знали про это. Но мы не решили еще ехать отсюда, остались здесь.
А почему решили остаться?
Потому что многие поуезжали назад, поприезжали.
Сколько людей жили здесь раньше, 20 лет тому назад?
Ну, много жило, вся деревня здесь была. Я не помню, сколько у нас населения было, но все жили. 70 домов. 60-70 домов.
Many farmers continued working their fields 6 months after the accident, and only then were told to evacuate, after their harvests were in.
Красивая была деревня, ну, которые получили квартиру, уехали в Гомель. Так много уехало на кладбище, молодых, все вот это вот. Муж мой 55 лет, он той женщины, сколько ему было? Они пенсии не дождались этой, ну, своей по 60 лет. Они все умерли, ушли на кладбище.
А умерли от чего?
Инфаркт, инсульт.
Не за никакой радиации?
Ну, кто его знает, может и радиация повлияла.
Well, 20 years after Chernobyl, I think it will come as a real shock to a lot of people to hear that the most significant public health impact of Chernobyl has been on mental health. That really the conclusion we've come to is that fear of radiation is a far more potent health threat than radiation itself.
It's only been the release of the findings of the Chernobyl Forum 20 years after Chernobyl that we realized that it wasn't really such a bad accident in terms of industrial accidents.
People just don't know enough about radiation. People are afraid of radiation as something that causes genetic mutations and they'll wind up with children with birth defects. People don't realize that there is radiation everywhere. People are exposed to radiation from natural settings and also from man-made sources, but that it's just part of life.
While experts agree that we are all exposed to radiation daily, there is no consensus about the answer to the question, how much radiation is too much?
It's a lot more dangerous to drive your car out of the driveway in the morning than it is to be near a little bit of radiation.
For the vast majority of people in these regions that were considered affected by Chernobyl, the dose of radiation they received was really pretty much in line with normal background radiation that people experience all around the world every day of their lives.
People have this fear of radiation because it is mysterious, it's powerful. At high doses, they have a right to fear it. At medium doses, sort of a right. At low doses, it's silly.
Duck. Then you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Duck.
What all of us are having to contend with is the very strong, deeply held feeling against nuclear, which started out with revulsion against what nuclear weapons do, and fear of what nuclear weapons might yet do with proliferation and so on, terrorists, whatever. And that easily translates into a fear of and a kind of a blank fear of nuclear power.
Nuclear power makes widely available all of the ingredients of do-it-yourself bomb kits, the materials, skills, equipment, knowledge. And it does so in innocent-looking civilian disguise, so countries like Iran can claim, oh, we're not making bombs, we're just making electricity vital to our development.
Nuclear power plants, of course, can turn into a mushroom cloud.
Nuclear power plants can produce nuclear bomb materials, but they cannot explode like a nuclear weapon. The 5% enriched uranium used to generate power has a much lower density than the 95% enriched uranium required to trigger a nuclear bomb.
It'd be a big dud. What we worry about in a nuclear power plant, of course, is loss of cooling, reactor melting, and these fission products like xenon and krypton making their way out into the environment. Now, at Chernobyl, it was a steam explosion that caused the release of radioactivity. It was not a nuclear explosion.
While the Chernobyl contamination region is starting to recover after 20 years, Rancho Seco in California, which was shut down in 1989, continues to be a problem. In 2006, 17 years after it produced its last electricity, Rancho Seco still employs over 100 workers involved with the continued cleanup and decommissioning of the plant. This costs about $30 million a year. The total cost of keeping Rancho Seco shut down has been more than the cost to build it, almost $500 million to date. The disposal of old reactors is a hugely expensive problem whose bill is now coming due. And even though Rancho Seco is shut down, its nuclear waste is still stored on site, requiring expensive monitoring and protection. Amory Lovins has been one of the leading experts on U.S. energy policy for the last 25 years. 20 years ago, he supported the shutdown of Rancho Seco. Despite the loss of 20 years electrical generation and the very high costs to clean up and decommission that plant, he still believes it was the right decision.
It made sense and made money to shut down the Rancho Seco plant. It was indeed, as matters turned out, just as I had predicted, cheaper not to run it than to run it, because the efficiency and other resources they substituted for it cost less than the cost of fueling it and fixing it. The decommissioning cost would have had to be paid in any event. All that's different is the timing. We're going to have to decommission them and deal with their waste, whether we extend their lives or not.
The shutdown of Rancho Seco raises a number of issues that those who would build new nuclear power plants must address.
I think the three things on the public's mind are: one, safety; two, economics; and three, what do we do with the waste?
My problem with nuclear power is that there's never really been a solution for what to do at the end of the life of the nuclear plant. I think nuclear power, relatively speaking, in looking in overall terms since it first started in the 1950s, doesn't have a bad record compared with other energy industries. However, if there is an accident, the results are around for a very long time, if not forever. And nuclear waste and disposal of plant sites for the future, I don't think has ever been resolved.
Well, there's several ethical issues related to nuclear power, I think primarily regarding high-level radioactive waste. And let's take Yucca Mountain as an example of some of the ethical issues. The original intent, going back to the 1950s and 60s, is that the fuel would be reprocessed and that the uneconomic residual radioactive material would be buried in a geologic repository, and that the fissionable material would be extracted and then recycled in reactors.
Bright light city gonna set my...
The bright lights of Las Vegas glow over a corner of the Nevada desert about 100 miles southeast of the empty, desolate area surrounding Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain is the federal government's planned nuclear waste geologic repository. It is part of our plan for storing nuclear wastes that began with the start of the nuclear power industry in the 1950s. Originally scheduled to open in 1998, the project has been set back repeatedly by lawsuits, money shortfalls, and scientific controversies. The Department of Energy's current best-case opening date for Yucca Mountain, which would only hold 77,000 tons of nuclear waste, is 2017. U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada has promised to block the opening of Yucca Mountain. The powerful Las Vegas tourist industry is too critical to Nevada to risk loss of business due to nuclear fears. Yucca Mountain has cost at least $9 billion to date and will require additional funding of $49 billion over the next 10 years to be ready to receive nuclear waste.
What we're saying is, for the greater good of the United States, generating 23% or 25% of our electricity in New England and the Southeast and California and so on, for the greater good, we're asking the people of the state of Nevada to accept this waste on behalf of the rest of the country. So that's an ethical issue. Once the waste is in place at Yucca Mountain, we're saying for the benefit of our generation, we're asking some future generation to bear some of the risk for the benefit that we're getting today.
Dan Kamen received his PhD in physics from Harvard and is now a distinguished professor and founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory at UC Berkeley.
If we do expand the nuclear industry, we're probably talking about not just Yucca Mountain number 1, but we need to already be having a debate about Yucca Mountain number 2. And since we haven't even figured out how to deal with number 1 well, that's a pretty big order to try to deal with.
The state of Nevada may well prevail in its legal fight to show that the Yucca Mountain site is unsuitable and has long been known to be unsuitable.
What this country has right now is a great deal of waste scattered around the country, largely at the reactor sites of spent fuel pools in temporary storage that has become longer and longer term because we don't have a long-term repository.
We're going to have to do whatever's the least unsatisfactory thing with the waste because we don't have a good solution either technically or politically. Unfortunately, the waste program has been managed with such incompetence and mendacity for decades that communities are unlikely to believe any representations made to them anyway. It's been a national disgrace for a long time.
Recollecting all that waste that's in pools, that's in canisters, putting it on trucks, transporting it, then getting it into a long-term repository has a variety of risks that have me, as someone who's worked on risk issues, and particularly on the human side of it. That looks to me like a serious and unaddressed problem for nuclear power so far.
The United States got itself in a big dilemma over the issue of spent or used fuel because a decision was made back in the Carter administration that there would be no recycling of used nuclear fuel. And that was going to mean that all the used fuel, the whole fuel bundle, was going to have to be buried in the ground for 100,000 or more years.
In order to recycle nuclear waste, it must first be reprocessed.
Reprocessing means that you chop up the highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel and dissolve it in strong acids and then treat it chemically to try to separate the plutonium and uranium from the fission products.
Somewhere in the 1970s, 1980s, that scenario changed, and it changed for two reasons. One was economics. There was a glut on the market of fissionable material, so why bother reprocessing? It was too expensive. And second, the idea of nuclear proliferation came forward. That is, if the United States began to reprocess fuel and other countries would reprocess fuel, we would then be creating fissionable material for nuclear weapons.
Now that the Energy Act of 2005 has lifted the ban on recycling used fuel, we don't need to bury the whole fuel bundle anymore. We can recycle it, take out the majority of the uranium and plutonium, which can then be reused as fuel, and then the only waste is a small amount of fission products, such as cesium and strontium.
And if you are going to reprocess, that changes the dynamics for how much material you're going to send to waste storage and how intensely radioactive what you do send would likely be. So the rough guidelines are, if you did make the choice to reprocess, which increases your terrorism issues and potentially bomb issues because you have more plutonium around, you could reduce the volume of nuclear waste by sort of 90% or more.
We can get 20 times as much energy out of the same amount of uranium by recycling it rather than just taking it after one cycle and burying it in the ground.
Our whole environmental movement in the United States is based on recycling. Aluminum cans, paper, bottles. Why not nuclear fuel? Once we can get into that mindset that we should treat nuclear, the nuclear fuel cycle like we treat any other fuel cycle, that we should be recycling, reprocessing, recycling, then I think the public would have a change of heart. Roughly in a single person's lifetime, if all their electricity came from nuclear power, each person's equivalent waste would be put in a hockey puck about that size.
How can we compare the dangers of a hockey puck-sized container full of highly radioactive waste, the result of a lifetime of electricity generated with nuclear, with 1 million pounds of toxic waste from a coal-fired plant from that same lifetime of electricity generated by coal?
Coal produces atmospheric pollution and huge amounts of greenhouse gas. Coal-fired power plants in the United States alone produce 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. Whereas nuclear energy does not pollute the air.
Some of the heavy metals that are emitted from coal plants are radioactive. There's trace elements, uranium, cesium, strontium, other trace elements that are radioactive, radon gas, which comes out of a smokestack of a coal-fired plant.
Dominating the debate on the nuclear option are difficult safety issues.
You should not use as a way of boiling water, which is fundamentally what a nuclear power plant does, a technology which kills people when you mine the ore which is needed, which threatens the communities where you build the plants, which creates a waste which will be toxic for hundreds of thousands of years and which no one has the slightest idea how to dispose of safely, and which it now turns out we can only allow to happen in countries whose governments we like. And if nuclear material is too dangerous to be used and to be in the hands of people who are hostile to the United States, it is too dangerous to be used as a central energy technology in the 21st century.
The cost of building and operating nuclear power plants is also a hotly debated issue.
There are really two reasons why many countries, including the United States, stopped building nuclear power plants about 30 years ago. First was the fear of nuclear power and nuclear radiation. This was kind of tied into the whole anti-war movement and the campaign against nuclear weapons. And even I, back then, kind of lumped nuclear energy in with nuclear weapons as all part of the same Holocaust. The second reason was economic. Fossil fuels were a lot cheaper then, and coal in particular has always been a little bit cheaper than nuclear energy, and so a lot of the utilities just said, why bother with the angst and the hassle of nuclear power when we can just build another coal plant, and that's what they've been doing ever since.
Prior to Chernobyl, over 100 nuclear power plants were built in the United States.
Building those plants has arguably been a good thing in terms of producing a lot of relatively low cost and relatively carbon-free power. But at the same time, we don't know how to compare those subsidies and benefits to those we might put on solar or wind or biomass or some of the alternatives. And until we can think through what the subsidies do in terms of costs and risks across a range of technologies, we're never going to make choices that are at the sort of higher level where we do a comparison for the individual costs, the social costs of choosing nuclear or choosing biomass or choosing to stay with coal.
When you compare generating electricity using a coal plant and generating electricity using a nuclear power plant, we can compare it in two respects. One, of course, is the economic aspect. When we're looking at coal, we're looking at least originally, we're looking at a low capital cost and a high fuel cost. When we're looking at nuclear energy, we're looking at a very, very high capital cost with a very, very low fuel cost. When we compare fossil fuel, coal in particular, with nuclear power plants in terms of the environmental impact, with coal, of course, we have CO2 emissions, we have heavy metal emissions. Emissions from a nuclear power plant on a daily basis are rather low. The environmental impact is quite low.
Nuclear power is uneconomic even if you assume its risks are zero. I've talked to the chairs of a number of the utilities normally viewed as the most likely to build another nuclear plant in this country. And privately, they say it's unfinanceable in the private capital market, so we probably won't build it because we can't figure out how to finance it.
There's a very large subsidy called the Price-Anderson Act, which basically provides a risk insurance for anyone who operates a nuclear power plant. And it means that their liability is capped at about $500 million for an accident of almost any size. The value of that to the industry is almost incalculable. If you ask nuclear professionals, they'll basically say, we wouldn't build any plants in this country without the Price-Anderson Act.
In the United States, we have new additional nuclear subsidies from August 2005, roughly equal to the entire capital cost of the next 6 plants to be built, if any. It remains to be seen whether this will produce any orders. The capital market is still not enthusiastic about nuclear.
What are our energy choices in a world concerned about climate change amid rapidly increasing demand for energy?
When we're talking about big baseload electrical production for an economy like the United States, which, face it, represents 25% of the world's industrial capacity, you really only have 3 forms of technology to supply that baseload energy. There's fossil fuels, mainly coal and some natural gas. There's hydroelectric energy from building hydro dams, and there's nuclear energy. Unfortunately, nearly all the potential hydro energy has already been built to capacity, so that is really not an alternative any longer for increasing energy supply. Therefore, you really have a choice between coal and nuclear.
Well, my response to the comparison between coal-fired power plants and nuclear power plants is that's like asking me whether I want to be shot with a single-shelled revolver or an automatic weapon. They're both lethal. They're both dangerous. They're both old-fashioned, outmoded, dangerous energy technologies, and we need to replace both of them. We don't need to shut down all of our existing nuclear power plants. What we need to do is invest our energy, our creativity, our resources, our imagination in a new generation of power technologies that are efficient, that are clean, that are cheap, that are safe.
If you look then to how to make more electricity to complement its more efficient use, the big choice here is not between a big nuclear, coal, or gas-fired plant.
Lovins argues that large central plants waste too much power in distributing their electricity, so we should be looking at micropower solutions like wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass energy, together with increases in electrical efficiency.
Nuclear power, remarkably enough, is an energy technology which is most important in countries where governments interfere most massively in the free energy market. So nuclear power is a technology that only works if you ignore the signals of the marketplace, which tell you a basic fact. Sunlight is a cheaper way to boil water than uranium.
There's no technology that gives you more power carbon-free than nuclear in terms of each new plant you install is a lot of clean power. So there's a big, big benefit on what I think is going to be one of the main drivers for the 21st century, low carbon energy.
In the 1950s, the early days of nuclear power, it was seen as an energy source so inexpensive it would hardly pay to meter it.
Nuclear power is a very sad story in the history of technology because a lot of talented people have worked hard on it for decades to try to make a go of it. But that doesn't automatically guarantee success. The fleet of nuclear plants in the world is getting old. The result is that just due to the normal aging of the fleet, by 2050 they'll be all gone, even if you assume they last about 40 years. And starting in the next few years, the world nuclear enterprise is tipping into net retirements. More old plants are retiring than new ones are being added.
Is the perception of nuclear power changing? We are seeing some environmental leaders evaluating the risks of nuclear power and the risks of climate change and concluding that moving to more nuclear is a risk they would willingly take on because of how dramatic the global consequences of climate change can be versus how hopefully more localized the risks of nuclear might be.
I think the handful of environmentalists, and it really is just a handful, who are promoting nuclear power have got it exactly wrong and don't understand that this will make the climate change worse by diverting money, attention, and time away from more effective solutions.
Well, are we going to change our energy behavior? Yeah, we can be a lot more conservative, but it's not enough. especially not with India and China and other developing parts of the world coming on fast with big energy demand. So then you look around, well, what works now? And I had to revise my thinking on this. What works now is nuclear power. This is a pretty mature technology. Because nuclear's on the shelf, I just looked at it again and started realizing this was preferable than having a climate collapse.
The world is still learning about the costs and consequences of nuclear power. Many things that almost everyone, experts, politicians, and the general public, believed to be true about Chernobyl proved to be false. Today, as the nuclear power plants in the United States near the end of their useful life, the question of how to replace the 20% of our electricity they generate must be addressed. Will concerns about global warming bring new nuclear reactors onto the American landscape? The long lead time to develop new sources of electricity makes answering this question an urgent priority.